Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm Nathan Rittenhouse, and today I am joined by Carl Johnson, globally known as KJ. I've never heard anybody except maybe his wife refer to him as Carl. KJ is the city director of the C.S. Lewis Institute. I'll introduce him by saying that if you look at his office, it is decorated in themes influenced by the Marine Corps and the Three Stooges. So you let your imagination run wild there and piece that all together. KJ, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, and I'm not your co-host, not Cameron McAllister. How about that?
There you go. In this podcast, I have a conversation with KJ Carl Johnson, city director for Chicago of the C.S. Lewis Institute, and we jump into looking at some of the ways in which we find hurdles in our lives in our own spiritual formation and discipleship. KJ is a wealth of wisdom here, and so listen to this one carefully. I think you're going to find some really helpful nuggets. KJ, I want to talk about a number of things with you from the work that you're doing with the C.S. Lewis Institute, really kind of, and then get your advice on some books that you're always trying to get me to read that I haven't yet, um, and talk more generally. I think you know our audience, but one of the things that I've been reflecting on and thinking about recently is that the vast majority of our digital consumption, globally speaking, is in um, education for the purpose of some sort of like benefit. So it's going to help me make more money. It's going to help me build more muscle. It's going to help me kind of a biohack, make my life more efficient. So education, not in the sense of career necessarily, but of like, this is going to make my life better. If I do this, if I follow this guy's workout routine, if I follow this person's financial advice, it's very, very heavy on the quick fix educationally. So that's part of it. Then the other side is entirely focused on just entertainment. And half of what counts labels itself as education is entertainment also. So you have kind of this trending narrative toward not just our digital, but our life engagement is really focused on these categories of how do I make my life better in a very materialistic, concrete sense, or how do I distract myself from life or giggle along the way. So education and entertainment. And what's lacking in that is this in between space where there really isn't a market for people thinking like, you know what? I'd love to become more virtuous. I would like to become more like Jesus. I don't know who's doing that well that has this exploding, online platform of saying, no, it's going to take routine discipline and you're going to knuckle down, buckle down and do this. And the spiritual disciplines are interesting to people, but I don't think they're viral. Can you
Oh,
say, am I reading the world correctly there? And then what are some of the things that you see that play into that? Because you would be one of those people who I think is an exception where you're leading programming for people who are like, okay, there's got to be something else in life here for me to focus on. Can you kind of talk me through what you're doing, what you're seeing, and then what's going on in the lives of the people who want to lean into this category that I'm claiming is largely missing in our broader cultural
yeah.
conversation?
Yeah, let's leave the what I'm doing, off for a moment. I think, I would channel my, inner Cameron here by pointing out that not all of it is quick fixes. I think you're right to include the category of the material. Um, Discipline seems to sell these days, and as we
Hmm.
know, Cameron is much beefier than you and I knew him back at RGIM these days because he's engaged in some of this, and it's all for good. I mean, building yourself up physically, taking care of the temple, so to speak. But I do think there's sort of a miss. You're right to identify this missing category. When you said virtues, I immediately thought towards David Brooks. Virtue, the resume virtues versus eulogy
Hmm.
ethics,
Flesh that
and
out a little bit
that
because I
w-
think that's an
yeah,
important
that
point.
he yes, that we spend most of our time in life working on those things that would show up on our resume. But really what matters in life are those things that will be said about us at our eulogy. And what
Mm.
do they say, when your great grandpa Rittenhouse is you and you've passed on and your grandson is talking to you and doing your ceremony and giving your eulogy, he's not going to talk about what a great podcaster you were and what a great writer and the great talks. He's going to talk about all of the things he knows for you personally, that you were
Mhm.
wise, that you were patient, that you were kind, you were quick to listen, those
May it be
sorts of
so.
things. May it be so. So those are the things we should focus on. But today's society focuses more on what would appear on a resume because those are the things that get us ahead in life. No one
Mhm.
hires you for your kindness, so to speak. And now that may not be entirely true. So I think you're right. We don't have there's not a really good market for cultivating holiness.
Well,
There isn't a real strong holiness movement, is there?
but I would say as you're saying that, I would say that 99% of the people listening to that idea about the virtues resume versus virtue obituary or eulogy there would be something in them resonating saying like, "Yes, that's right. I have no idea how to do that.
Right.
How do I get
Well,
from where I am to there?"
this goes to an ongoing conversation you and I've been having about. I think there is a small-ish, maybe it's not so small anymore, growing market that is trying to address that with the disciplines. I think stepping aside from quick fixes, I think some people realize, yes, if I want to look good, I need to hit the gym every day. Cameron's a great example of that. There are other
Mhm.
people who go, if I
And
want to
only
get a
eat
PhD.
broccoli and rice and
Exactly.
chicken thighs, you know?
And as clearly I'm not there yet. Um, if I want to get a PhD and be an expert in this area, it's going to take me this much time, and I'm going to have to dedicate years of my life and great financial sacrifice and all that. With the spiritual realm, there is this growing cottage industry of spiritual formation,
Mhm.
which does tend towards the soul, soul care, and helps us cultivate these things. But as our friend Tom Tarrant has said, um, it's an unregulated industry, and I think it can become it has been affected by our consumerist mindset in some ways where I call it spiritual navel gazing, where it
Mhm.
is an individualized effort. It caters to our Western sensibilities, where we're going to sit there and we're going to practice these things and we're going to become a better person because it's a self help culture that we live in,
Yep.
and
Mhm.
there's no follow through or call to action to help others do likewise, which I think would be in unity and harmony with the Great Commission. So I think there's something there, but I think we are still missing the mark in that center area that you're describing. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it sure does. No, I think as you're saying that, Grandpa Rittenhouse often has pointed out that spiritual disciplines often become just another measure of self focus and self interest. And so it's great that you were kind of throwing a flag on the play there as we go by to say this is not about necessarily. I mean, is there an anthropological vision that's lost here of what is it that a person is for and what is actually possible in a human life? Is it um, I kinda think of, back in it was 1953, Roger Bannister runs under 4 minutes in the mile for the first time. And then I mean, nobody had done it before in history. And then shortly after doing it, boom, 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 boom. Like once the idea was there that this is possible, then the dominoes start to fall and the records start to fall. And even now we're looking at, the potential of in the right conditions, is it theoretically, physiologically possible for a woman to break 4 minutes in the mile? The what Talk to me about mentorship and discipleship in that same paradigm, because I think a lot of people would say, you know what, I grew up in a situation where I wasn't around people who were actively cultivating and desiring to grow in these ways, and I could see the things that they were doing. Um, is part of is like is it purely a lack of information, or is it actually a lack of example that doesn't even make us think that this change is possible?
Yeah, that's a good way to go on that. It's not just information. What we're trying to get at is transformation. We want to become more like Christ. And in a Western ideal where we're very individualistic, we can pursue our own goals. We can be self-taught. You can YouTube anything. Um, but well, there's a parallel discussion that I don't want to go down a rabbit trail on of expertise and things like this. And you can very easily get caught up in things that are unhealthy. You can get if you get into the spiritual formation movement, you might find some um, real tending to your soul. But then, of course, if you're doing it alone, without community, without a mentor, and without discipleship, you can easily um, become that solo Christian that we don't want to become.
Hmm.
So we need to be plugged into the broader community. And I think um, one of the things we have to work on is the basics and fundamentals. Cameron has quoted the line "brilliance in the basics" a number of times on the podcast, and I think that's key. We need to focus on brilliance in the basics, and so I think one of the tendencies we have is try to make either we want a quick fix or we think there's going to be something highly, highly sophisticated that we have to reach the great heights of theology and apologetics and things like that to be transformed. But
Hmm.
reading your Bible and praying every day are basic fundamentals, and being in community with a mentor and peer-to-peer discipleship will help you grow in ways that just practicing disciplines won't do in and of themselves.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if I'm answering your question
No,
completely because
that
I
is.
kinda wanna go in 3 different directions there.
Yeah. Oh, look, a squirrel. Yeah. No, I think one of the interesting just relational observations that I've made is that actually, if you have a drive to do these things but can't find it, it can foster a unique sense of loneliness, spiritual loneliness, even if you have good friends. And I know for myself in my particularly high school days, spiritual friendship was just not something that I had people who were tracking on the same level of. And I was just speaking this week with a couple who have gone through real unique kind of re-encounter and deepening of their faith, and they're like, hey, we're getting together with our friends, and they just are not interested in these richer things in life like we are anymore. And so I think, what are some of the markers or steps forward for people? So I mean, for me it was like praying about it, like, Lord, I'd love to have somebody to journey with.
Yeah.
And in college that was materialized for me, and has since then. But recognizing that in those periods, first of all, some of those, maybe dry spiritual friendship zones or times in which we don't feel like we have a mentor or mentee with us. Um, what are some of the resources that, I mean, you've bounced all over the world. You didn't have this everywhere you've
No.
been. Talk to me about your own personal kind of walking through those
Mhm.
valleys of spiritual friendship, and then maybe what some resources are for people who are listening, because I think there are people who listen to Thinking Out Loud because they're like, actually, we don't have this level of conversation. We go to church, we're part of Bible studies and stuff, but maybe the focus is on other things. So what would be some things that you've experienced or that you could recommend in those trenches?
Yeah, you've touched on so many things, even just the fact that we're not finding this in some of our, what I would call primary communities like the church, partly because the church, and I don't mean to ever throw darts at the church because it's a tough thing to do, um, to pull off a body like that that has a lot of that's filled with sinners, right? My own
Well,
journey,
dart
I mean,
dart throwing at the church is an occupation that's already has somebody in that role. So
yes, exactly, and I don't wanna help him. I like to say, the church is the bride of Christ. We need to do our best to try to dress her up. So if there are some things that need to be addressed, and if I say anything like that, it's in that spirit. Um, I guess for your audience, you said I'm all over the world. It's helpful to know that before I joined you and Cameron at that prior, place of employment, I was in the Marine Corps for 20 years and lived in lots of different climes and places. So, I did yeah, you're right. As I came out of what I called, my period of hedonism and was getting serious about getting back into the faith and following Christ again, um, I had to pray about it. First off, I would say there are probably always some people around, and it does take prayer to root them out. Robert Coleman, I think, does a great job of pointing this out in his master plan of discipleship, known more for his master plan of evangelism, but he's also got the master plan of discipleship out there, and praying for people who are hungry uh, what I call low hanging fruit. They're out there, but sometimes we're not looking for them because maybe we're a little more self focused. But I did have to pray about it, and I realized one of the reasons why I went through that period of hedonism as a kid who grew up in church and took my faith seriously was that I was never discipled. There were some strong men of faith in my life, and I was in some good communities. And as long as I was in those communities, I was fine. And I liken it to secondhand smoke. In this case, kind of turning it on its head. That it was secondhand spiritual smoke. That I was imbibing good things, and I was on the straight and narrow. So that kind of highlights to me the importance of good community. But good community is only one piece of the puzzle. I needed someone to pour into me to make sure I knew how to do this stuff on my own. Because while, I am kind of taking some small shots out of our individualistic nature, we are individuals. We don't inherit our faith. We have to make the decision ourselves. So
Hmm.
I went on in my late 30s praying, and on a journey looking for it. And after a few near misses, that's when God walked me right up to this guy named Tom Terrence, who you and I have come to know and love, and I've never looked back. I found a man who followed Jesus, and I could imitate him as he imitated Christ, and I've never looked back. I've seen the importance now of having someone in my life, whether it's a mentor or guys like you and Cameron in my life that I know I can pick up the phone and call. So,
Hmm.
that's what that there's a lot more to it, but, I wanna pause there to give you a chance to respond or redirect.
Yeah, no, that's can let's sit here a second because it's interesting to me. You and I had this conversation several weeks ago that um there are people who communicate in in a way that you just get. And it differs. Like some people be like, "Oh, this preacher, this radio programming, this book, this author." Um, if you listen to the people that we quote, so Cameron, we jokingly quotes Dallas Willard all of the time, and Dallas Willard is kind of broad in that sense that oftentimes the way that he says things, you're like, "Oh yeah, that's short, sweet, to the point, and I get it," and everything downstream from that. I quote my grandpa a lot because we kind of have that communication style where I understand, I get it. And I think that's part of the beauty of the diversity of the Christian world out there is that there are authors and speakers and teachers and preachers who kind of are we find those people in life who for whatever reason we were talking about like Martin Lloyd Jones, like reading his book on the Sermon on the Mount. There's something more going on there than just the words on the page.
Yeah.
Like, there are people, and I'm not saying that people are writing new scripture, but there are people who are anointed in their communication styles of succinctly communicating things that are doctrinally true in ways in which you can immediately see the practical application of them. And so that's a gift to the world when people write stuff like that. But can you say a little bit more about kind of finding? I hate people going like, "Oh no, what are 10 books I should read?" or who's your favorite? Like, I I can't. I don't know. 'Cause there's always a
Yeah,
little bit of a
yeah, I can make a recommendation, but let me say as a little something first about that importance of that community, because I think what you're highlighting with the writers also can be captured in the people that are in our community. So, you and Cameron and I, just to use this for examples as context, as they're now we're all relatable to the people listening right now. We know a lot of the same people, and we know a lot of
Mhm,
other people. We've just been blessed to run in some circles, and we could do name dropping or something like that. But there's some really good, godly people that we have all been blessed to get to know. But we're drawn to certain ones. Now, one reason why I think you and Cameron and I mentioned some of the same ones is we're drawn to each other and we're drawn to some of the same kinds of people, but
mhm,
not all of them. One, I think if you are looking for that kind of discipleship and you want to see your growth um, fertilized, just to use that image, you have to be in with those people, and community is so incredibly important. I don't listen to too many of these leadership podcasts much, but I caught a clip by one of these church leaders, and I thought he said something really small but impactful. He said, "Leaders, you don't need to create more good content. You need to create good community." And I was like, "That's exactly right." Because as I'm in Chicago and I'm dealing with lots and lots of people in their 20s and 30s that are finding their way in life in general. Am I going to get married? What's my next job? My career? And not only that, but then of course a good church. Where do I stand theologically? I'm seeing a lot of loneliness,
mhm,
even loneliness in amongst a crowd and a group of people. You can be surrounded by people, but still be lonely. So community is incredibly important. And then I'll use this now. I'll segue into one of the books that you and I have talked about a bit. Is the book I've been trying to get you and Cameron to read, which you found my email from 2022 a few years ago. I'll even just hold it up. It's this one right here. It's called Dynamics of Spiritual Life by Richard Lovelace. And I recommend getting that yellow cover. There's a couple of them. That's the most recent one with the preface by Tim Keller, because in the preface, Keller says, "Anybody who reads this book will go, 'That's where Keller got all his great ideas.'" Um, Now, I don't know if you love Keller or not. Don't take it on that alone. There are a lot of people that sing the praises of this book, and in here he talks about the importance of community. What he gets into is he's a church historian by trade, and I'll just say this is one of my top 5 books all time. I'm gonna read and reread this book. Lewis says, you don't read 1,000 books, you read like 10 books, 10 times. That's what good learned people do. In this book, though, he talks about basically renewal, both personal renewal and church renewal, community renewal. And he goes through what are the conditions of renewal? Things like being aware of your own sin. What are the depths of my sin? Not something we talk about in great detail these days. Sin is actually kind of a four-letter word. We prefer to use therapeutic terms. And
Mhm.
then, of course, the flip side of that is being aware of God's holiness. That's where things start. And then the primary elements of renewal, things like justification, sanctification, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, and the authority we have in Christ. And then he just goes on and builds out both a biblical and a historical case of where the church has done it well and where the church has not done it well. And he brings in all what I like the word elements. He uses it. Elements, I think, is a helpful term because many times we look for formulas. In America, we're very
Mhm.
pragmatic
Mhm.
people. Give me the 5 steps, and we're very reductionistic. And he doesn't really do that. Elements to me are more like ingredients that go in a recipe. And, Grandma Rittenhouse might have this recipe that's been in the Rittenhouse family for ages. And every year she makes this at whatever the big gathering is, say it's Thanksgiving. And the next generation of Rittenhouse women want to capture this, but it's not written down. And they watch her every year and take notes. Oh, there's a little paprika, there's a little salt. And then they get frustrated because last year it was 3 dashes of salt and this year it's only two because she's flavoring it to taste. She
Mhm.
knows what it's supposed to be like. Um, and that's what I think these things are like. That's why I like the term elements. Elements go into it, but it's never a one set formula. But I think we've lost focus on both personal and cultural renewal, and we fought the battle on the wrong grounds. So I'll stop there again because I could go
Mm,
on.
yeah, well, so and having not read the book as the heathen that I am that you've been trying to convince me to do for 3 years, so just call it what it is as we go by here. I is there a degree this idea that you're using of elements. I think of like micronutrients in the soil. Some styles of gardening, there's sort of this idea that if you get your soil right, the fruit will take care of itself. So if you can develop the conditions for tomato to grow, and you have the right nutrients, right microbial life going on, the right elements of the soil, that voila, suddenly everything flourishes in that. Where there's a different way of like, why can't I get this tomato to grow bigger, brighter, and redder? Like, is there a way in which we try to jump straight to focusing on the fruit and skip the conditions from which it comes? And is that part of does that harmonize with this idea of the elements there?
Absolutely. That's actually really timely that you said that. I was in a discussion yesterday with some Christians, and it's kind of the point that I made is that as Americans, I would say the West in general, but especially those of us in the United States, we're pragmatic people. We love our pragmatism, um,
Huzzah!
and huzzah! And so knowing what the results, what the fruit are, we tend to sometimes backwards engineer it and think, okay, we start with the end in mind and forget that I hate the term, it's the journey, but it is a process that is supposed to get you to this point of fruit. You can't shortcut it. You can't grow lab meat and have it expected to be the same as Kobe beef. Um, and so sometimes I think we try to shortcut the process way too much. Now, I think the only thing I would say about your analogy there too is yes, I think you got to get all those mitonutrients and things right, and the fruit will take care of itself. But you know as well as I do, you also still have to tend. Sometimes you have to prune
The
things.
pruning, yeah,
Yeah, you got to make sure you tend to that fruit
the
in time so
trellis.
it doesn't. Yep, the trellis. Yeah, exactly. Trellis on the vine. So, but in general, yes, I think you're exactly right. I think we want to get to the end too quickly and in the process cut out the important in middle parts of growth. That's why, you know, I think these primary elements that Lovelace talks about, justification and sanctification, are overlooked as elementary, and those are the basics that we need to be brilliant at.
Hmm. Hmm. So we've discussed the role of community. Is Can you say something about speed? Because I would say that this is the speed of life. Because I would say this is another enemy of the entire enterprise that we're discussing. Of like, well, bam, the alarm goes off, feet hit the floor. You got to get this ready, get the dog, get the kids, get the in the car to work. Zoom, zoom, zoom. 11 hours later, you're back. Got to chop the vegetables, and before you know, you're asleep. Um, Help.
Yes. Yes. There's gotta be this is where I wish I was on my Dallas Willard because there's a great Dallas Willard quote in there about hurrying and busyness, but I'm not gonna grasp it at the moment. But, um, we can get caught up in, one of my famous proverbs that, um, activity is the illusion of progress, and there is something to today's life has a bit more inertia. We're constantly connected. We're constantly plugged in. I should be able to reach you at a moment's notice. And if you don't answer my text, why not? I'm upset with you now. And I can get all passive aggressive. Um, but at the same time, we haven't lost any time. We still have 24 hours in a day. We're jam packing our lives with so much and we're trying to keep up. I mean, I think a good microcosm of this is what we do to our children these days. We feel like children have to participate in everything in order to make it in life. And I was just listening to some analysis the other day of some of the top NBA stars that are in the NBA now. They didn't play in those leagues. Apparently, well, Kobe's not in, we've lost Kobe a few years ago, but he's still sort of a modern day NBA star. Kobe grew up overseas and didn't play in the typical NBA leagues, and his father had him playing soccer and stuff like that. Um, I think it was Steph Curry. I could be wrong on this one, but his father made him play other sports in ways. So, but today we jam pack. We want a kid in baseball forever or dance and things like that. And I'll extrapolate that out to our own professional lives and family. We're jamming so much in there, and we don't create any white space on the calendar for encounter. And I'm pretty convinced if you take a look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, I think those religious men that walked by him probably had a to-do list, and
Mhm.
were busy getting on their way, and I think about this, in my own life, when I go to church on Sunday morning, the parking lot between the parking lot and my church, um, there are usually 4 or 5 homeless people. And they're the same ones every week, and I kinda know which one is which, and so I've given some money, I realize some are gonna go drink it, and so I'm quick to walk by them, and one time I walked by and I stopped and I looked back and my wife had stopped and she was praying, and I'm like, "We gotta get to church on time," and she's praying
Hmm.
with this lady that I'd never seen before who was a street person. So we've allowed I'm rambling a little bit here, but we have allowed the busyness of life to crowd into those moments that are important, and, it'll either be Lewis or a Willard quote, whichever bingo card you have here. But no, actually, I think it's G.K. Chesterton who said that life is what happens in the interruptions.
Hmm.
And
Mhm.
I don't think we're allowing for those interruptions. I think we have our vision of what life should be, and we're executing it daily, and we're exhausting ourselves, and we're not allowing ourselves times for reflection. We're not allowing ourselves time to not only we might be making time, it's on our to-do list of reading the word and praying, but are we really digesting it? Are we really meditating on it? Are we really taking it in? And
Mhm.
are we giving ourselves that mental space to ponder on it throughout the day? I'll stop there. There's a lot more.
That's great. Yeah. No, I think I found some freedom when I recognized that being a disciple of Jesus meant leaving many good things left undone. And and so there are times in which I can't do everything. And so this kind of pull then to what do I focus on and what am I uniquely called to do? Jesus went and preached in other towns when the town he was in still had people who hadn't been healed yet.
Yep.
Um,
Well,
and
let me say that to being the called. Oswald Chambers said the need is not the call. You're going to see more needs than you can answer. The question
Mhm.
is, which ones are you answered to go to? And I don't think for those of us who are doers, and that's a lot of our society, we're going to feel like we have to do everything. And I feel like if you're if you focus on your call the way Nehemiah did, it gives you what I call the great get out of jail free card. You can say no to a lot of good things because it's not the ones to which you're called.
Mhm. Well, let me back up here a second and say I think there is a holy industriousness of like, oh, there's all these good things that I can focus on. There's a lot of stupid stuff I can focus on too. And so I think, just to let's rip the band-aid off and look at the wound here for a minute. I bet, if you're tracking your screen time on your phone or whatever app you're using, there's some other stuff where you could say,
Yeah.
do I have time to watch 2 hours of YouTube a day? I don't, so time is a little bit of a, somebody once jokingly told me, I don't think he was joking. He told my grandpa he had to get a second job to pay for all of his labor saving devices. Um,
Weapons of mass
it's
distraction is what Os
y-
Guinness calls them.
weapons of mass distraction. Yeah. So I mean, we can't be busier than our ancestors. Um,
No. No, you're exactly right. So you asked earlier about some of the things I'm doing. As part of the C.S. Lewis Institute, one of the things we do is a very intentional 1-year discipleship program. We're a discipleship ministry, despite the name Lewis. We're not a Lewis fan club. We love Lewis, but we try to build people up in heart and mind the way Lewis was. And one of the first things we have people do as the end of the program is a time audit, and they
mhm.
sit down with a spreadsheet, a chart, and they fill in what they do with their time, and they're often amazed at how little time they have had in life, or they realize how much time they actually do have and how much they waste. And one of the questions I often hear is, "Where does my time go?" And it's usually sitting here scrolling, or it's binging Netflix or something. Those are the biggest. It was years ago. The CEO of Netflix said our biggest competitor now is sleep.
Hmm. Well, that's a telling line there.
Yeah.
Can can I use that to transition? I'm like thinking of all kinds of things I want to ask you about here. So we talked about community. We've talked about speed. Can you say something about rest? Um, and I was listening to some analysis. Somebody was saying that they're convinced that in the future, a lot of what we now consider to be mental health issues will just be downstream of messed up circadian rhythms of just chronic fatigue. We're not resting, sleeping. We're not actually treating our bodies as if we're human, and that's physiologically speaking. What are the spiritual equivalents of that? And again, we're recognizing we live in a hyper like we act like being super productive, super blessed. I haven't taken a vacation in years as a badge of honor. Talk to us a little bit about spiritually what that is indicating, not just in an annual sense, but on a day to day. How do we think of? I've been saying in talks recently that sleep is a spiritual discipline. I'm hoping you'll back me up on this.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think. Well, I may go in a direction that you weren't expecting, but I think it'll resonate with you. But first, when you were talking about we're not any busier than those people in centuries before. You're right. I think one of the key differences is electricity, and it is
Hmm.
touching
Mhm.
on the lack of sleep, and our circadian rhythms are much more out of whack. We had to stay in cycle with the sun and the moon and the sunrise and sunset. I'll speak from experience here. I was a pilot in the Marine Corps, and I was a night systems instructor, so I taught people how to fly on night vision devices. And my I slammed my body clock back and forth from a day schedule to a night schedule all the time, to the point where I still think my circadian rhythm is spinning. So I used to be an excellent morning person, and I am not anymore. I think I broke my clock, and I miss that. I miss being able just to pop up out of bed. And I do think that we have, now there's a whole cottage industry on sleep hygiene, and we're selling mouth tape so people can sleep and stuff like that. So I agree with you 100%. It's funny you ask about rest, because that was in my prayers this morning, asking God to help me actually rest in Him. Um, when we think of rest, we think of pausing and stopping from our activities and doing nothing. And doing nothing isn't necessarily rest. Um, we can, for me, what's incredibly restful can be reading, a good
Mhm.
book like Lovelace or something else, or something that you or Cameron have recommended to me. But um, One of the things there's a book, called The Radical Pursuit of Rest. If I'm here recommending books, I'll give you another, by, John Kessler from, retired from Moody Bible Institute. And he's the first one to turn me on to this notion, but then, I read, Glittering Vices, which you guys I know have brought up on the
Mhm.
podcast, by, Rebecca DeYoung, who's an incredible teacher, and she's reinforced this. When it comes to rest and busyness is a form of slothfulness.
Mm.
And when we think of slothful, we think of someone who's lazy, sitting on their rear end, the typical 1980s slacker, of which I was one. And that certainly is slothfulness. But what we tend to do is fill our schedules with busyness, and it militates against reflection. And that's actually a form of slothfulness. And if you think I'm wrong, let me give you an example. Think back to a time when you were in school, whether it's high school or college, and you had a big deadline due. And all of a sudden, you decided it was time to organize your refrigerator, do some spring cleaning, and you were incredibly productive in all of those things that you used to procrastinate because you just didn't want to get down to the work. Your garage now all of a sudden is masterfully clean and organized and alphabetized in the herbs and spices in your kitchen. Um, that's a form of slothfulness. And I think we have given way to this productivity trap as a way to avoid quiet and solitude. And, one of the things that bugs me these days is when I'm in church and every minute is filled with sound. Like, many churches when you're coming to the table and you're doing communion, um, I really like a protracted period of quiet reflection, praying. But nowadays in churches, there's music or something because we just don't like the dead silence. And worship leaders out there, I'm sorry. You can, mail Nathan and tell him not to have me anymore. But I was in a church once, a small church in Northern Virginia that did that. Every week they did communion every week. It was not Presbyterian, sorry, Cameron. It was not a liturgical church, but they did communion every week, and they gave you like 5 minutes of quiet. And I found that to be incredibly nourishing for my soul, and I missed it when we left that church. So, we fill that space up with everything. I have tried to stop listening to podcasts so much because I realized I was filling up every moment with
Mhm.
talking and
Yep.
music, and we need more time of reflection. So,
That's helpful. I ran across an interesting distinction. I believe it's in one of Andy Crouch's book, maybe The Tech Wise Family, where he makes a distinction between rest and leisure.
Mhm.
Where you look at kind of the biblical idea of God creates 6 days and then rests, where he would say that rest is what happens after good work, where leisure is the experience of pleasure based on the work of others. So, you go to the resort somewhere, somebody else is cooking your food, cleaning your rooms, all of that. But there's this idea of rest is a stopping, but it is also an acknowledgement and a resting in the satisfaction of the goodness that has been completed. And so, can we make a step here and transition from thinking about the goodness of rest back into then being thoughtful about the quality of the work that we are created to do and doing? And we'll go on forever. Maybe we'll end on this one. Can you say some things about the value of seeing your work as worship, or the meaningfulness of what we maybe would classically call vocation, or a sense of how do we recapture this thing where we've kind of like, here's my 9 to 5 and then here's my faith. How do we start to harmonize what I'm spending the bulk of my waking hours doing with it being a catechesis and a training ground for the type of person that God is growing me to be? What are some references or resources or some uh, good kind of taglines there to help us think thoughtfully about what we're doing with our actual money making endeavors?
yeah, that's a good question, and I know there's the faith and work movement has really emerged in some strength in recent years to try to answer that, and even the late Tim Keller started a program out of his own church called the Gotham Fellowship that answers some of those things. But what I like to think of it is I like to tie it into my discipleship. Um, we are called to Christ first and foremost, and we're to glorify Him in all that we do. So you work as unto the Lord. And I think sometimes we create, we've heard about the sacred and secular, and it's really should be no divide between the two, and that everything, all our work should be sacred. And I like to think that the call to discipleship is a call to come unto Christ, and we're to become more like Christ and live out our discipleship in day to day life. And many times I think we divorce it from that. And, if you're called to be a farmer or an accountant or, pick your vocation, live that out as unto Christ, as an offering unto him. Romans 12 talks about, giving yourself up as a sacrifice. But I also look at it as a means of living out my discipleship, because if I'm doing something as unto Christ, you talked earlier about there's just something different, like in the certain people we read and talk to. I think that will show. And I really do think, if I looked at my own career, 20 years in the Marine Corps, and really it was the latter probably 8 years or so where I was really living more in line with my discipleship, and I had a clear picture of how I should live. I actually had more people coming to me, talking to me about my faith. I didn't really have to go looking for it. And I had opportunities to live out my faith and behave in Christ-like ways, in ways that I would have behaved differently prior. And
Mhm.
so I don't know what it would look like in your particular, vocation, listeners, but I would say that if you look at it as a means of living out your discipleship, that could make it, I think, more fulfilling and tie it into what God is trying to show you and do in you. And I like to use sort of this would be a Lewisian, a C.S. Lewis like metaphor here, but sometimes I think we look at those things as cul-de-sacs. The cul-de-sac's a dead end when really it should be a roundabout. And so, yes, maybe you're an accountant or a farmer, but you're doing this for a greater purpose. And whatever
Mhm.
that purpose is, you may not even know. God will use these things, but it'll also be a work in you at the same time. So I would look at it in those terms of living out your discipleship through your vocation. And in that process, God will,
That
whether you
that's
become a witness in your workplace or you're just an example.
and the neat thing about the kind of that outline and framing you're giving, that works also if you're a student listening to this. Your studies fit right into this. You're a stay-at-home mom, you're retired, um, you live in a nursing home. I don't know, like there's a great flexibility, and it's not like there's a list of like, here are the 10 Christian jobs.
Yeah,
Um,
I like to say it gives dignity to those that might be what we might think of as more menial jobs and tasks in life. It
mhm.
gives them all the same dignity.
'Cause as part of that, we're refusing to look at the total evaluation of reality in solely economic terms.
Oh,
And
absolutely. Absolutely. There's a quote by Lovelace in the book. I had it on hand, so I'm cheating here, but he said that the Protestant disease of cheap grace can produce some of the most selfish and contentious leaders and lay people on earth, and more difficult to bear in a state of grace than they would be in a state of nature. And I think if we're not living out our discipleship, we're skipping over these basics that I talked about, and we become these shallow copies of what we could be.
mhm, mhm. How one final question. I said one more thing, but can you give me a sense of how you navigate the the light in knowing there's always more? So you get to rub shoulders with people who have been
Oh yeah.
studying and praying and spiritually growing. The delight of knowing that there's always more that God has for us, with the ability to rest and to receive and delight in what God has done in our lives. Not we don't want to spiritually plateau and be like, well, I'm 52, I've got it all figured out. And so say something just in closing, I think of that ebb and flow of the beauty of leaning into knowing that God still has more for you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm thankful there's more, because when we're on the other side of glory, if there was going to be a point where we would culminate, that would really seem disheartening. Okay, so now what do we do for the rest of eternity? But we'll never plumb the depths. I like to, you're making me think of well, I think you met him, Jerry Root, retired professor at Wheaton College, probably one of the leading C.S. Lewis experts in the world. But he likes to talk about this inexhaustible. He uses knowledge as an example, but you could put it into anything, and then he translates it to God. But have you read everything in the Bodleian Library? Of course
No,
not.
you have not.
Have you? So one, you shouldn't. make absolute claims because you don't have absolute knowledge. Now extrapolate that out to any other vocation, and there's always something more, which to me stimulates me to continue to grow more. But also the flip side is it keeps me humble because I always know,
Hmm.
and this is my fear, is whenever I'm teaching or talking, um, someone like Jerry Root or Oz Guinness or, a Dallas Willard like person is sitting there and knows a lot more than me. And I don't want, if, from a selfish point of view, I don't want to look like an idiot and say something dumb, but also I want to continue to grow. So it keeps me humble, but also keeps me reaching for more. I mean, you got a family now. You can answer lots of questions to the person who's never had a family, but you still quote Grandpa Rittenhouse all the time. And
Hmm.
Grandpa's always
Hmm.
got something to teach you. I can't wait to meet Grandpa Rittenhouse myself. Um, but it stimulates me, excites me to know that God's got something more for me. I mean, even if I know something, I can go deeper on it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think
That
that
seems
is
like an
part of the.
inadequate response, but I
No,
think that's going to really come down to the individual in a lot of ways too.
I think it does this idea of the joy of the Lord is our strength, that there's something uniquely there's a unique pleasure of being a Christian in the posture in which we lean into the unknown. And I think living in a culture that has just a tremendous amount of fear of what happens next or the world's going like of thinking like, "Ah, I know somebody who knows something about what's about to happen here." Um, and he was good. And so
Well,
I
that's a
think
good way of putting it because I think we've kind of gotten into these. I think one of the reasons, and this would be another podcast, but some of the things we wrestle with in culture, I think we've gotten to a point where we expect absolute knowledge, where you can know something absolutely rather than just sufficiently, and it can lead into arguing over vaccines, elections, whatever you want. And I think that might be one of the 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 subcurrents there of always getting to know and grow more that might hold us back. Like, well, don't you just know it? It's sort of like
yeah.
Jesus died for my sins. What else is there?
Well, I think we're proving the point by the fact that this podcast is bumping on 50 minutes here already that we have not we haven't plumbed the depths of the knowledge of KJ on this. So, KJ, thank you so much for your time. We'll leave some links into the show notes here, particularly for a link to the yellow cover version of spiritual the dynamics of the spiritual life by Richard Lovelace. And where can people follow along or check out some of what you're doing?
You can find me at CSLI Chicago on most platforms. If you want to follow me, it's kind of weird. KJ7562. It's my military MOS. So you could find me there, or just follow Thinking Out
Google
Loud. That's all you
KJ
need to do.
Johnson and the C.S. Lewis Institute, and you can
There you go.
track with their website, see what's going on there, and uh, tons of other resources available through that. KJ, thank you so much.
Hey, this is a
And
lot of fun.
yep, and thanks to all of you who have stuck with it and listened. Hopefully, this has been a blessing to you as it has been to me. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, podcast where we think out loud about current events, spiritual formation, and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.